Hi everybody, I'm here with Mark from Rockaway, and as a lot of you will know, there's a gig with his band The Mob coming up at Rockaway. Tickets were available through Patreon. As far as I know, they're all sold out now. But Mark, for Luddites like myself, maybe you could just explain what Patreon is and why you've sold the tickets through that channel.
Hi everybody. So Patreon is basically a crowdfunding sort of platform. I can't pretend to know too much about it either because it just came across my radar and I thought that could work for us. Now I'm going to bore you a bit with some historical stuff. Back in the day when me and Steve were but like little scamps running around, we used to go and watch this band called Here and Now who did free tours. And they go around the country on a bus, smoking loads of pot and passing a hat round at the end of each show to collect the money to get to the next show. And it was a model that we stumbled across, in my case anyway, completely by accident, because we were punks and it said anarchy on the poster. And so we assumed it must be a punk band and went along for this show. Only to find this bunch of long hairs.
Yeah, it would be fair to say Here and Now were archetypal hippies, but their ideas were quite inspiring.
Well, really, I think anyone who came across them, and to this day, there's still plenty of people. They still play, I think. I would assume.
Yeah.
Anyway, but they don't still do free tours, obviously. But we were like smitten with this idea, and as a 17 or 18-year-old. And me and the rest of the guys in the mob jumped on the bus and went off to Holland on tour with them because we were so impressed with what they were doing, and somehow found ourselves in this world. And we spent a good bit of time, and then we were really inspired by them. They lived in a commune in Ivor. It all looked like a world that I wanted to live in. And it seemed to be the epitome of everything that punk rock stood for with me, with like self-determination and sort of like doing good and doing the right thing and not being caring about money and one thing or another.
And really DIY,
DIY,
because the whole thing at that time, at the beginning of punk, was that people were making their own records, starting their own little labels. In a way, what Here and Now did, and Mark's band and my band started to do free tours. So we were kind of applying a total independent DIY ethos to touring as well as making our own records.
And I think like growing up in or being in Yeovil at that formative part of our lives, we had no external influence in the way that if you'd have been in London, you'd have been going off to see X-Ray Specs or The Damned every night of the week. But we weren't in, our information was coming from different places, and our proximity to Stonehenge and everything had always sort of interested us in that element of the counterculture as well as the punk rock element that we were really coming from. Anyway, I've strayed a long way off the subject.
Yeah, but
here.
that's all right, because we'll get back there.
Pretty much a normal behaviour, but what we really loved about this whole thing was this element that if we work together and we all chuck a pound in the pot, that we can make this work, we can make this carry on, and we can make positive change in the world, even if it was only in our world at the time. But it wasn't only in our world. We know that now, 40 years later, that this stuff still reverberates with a lot of people who were involved at the time and people who've come along since, much more so even. So I've always had this massive faith in crowdfunding. And while I'm on the subject, because we touched on this the other day when me and Steve were chatting, Stonehenge Festival, which was a massive free festival run entirely anarchically. There was no hierarchy at all. People arrived in the field and set up roads and things.
Yeah, there were no organisers. It's really difficult to explain this, I think, to people now, because the world is so restricted, and people's movements and access to things are so restricted. People would put out posters saying Stonehenge Festival, summer solstice, blah blah blah. And people would turn up with stuff. I mean, Here and Now would turn up with a PA. There was some people.
Steve Stage would bring a stage.
Yeah, or polytantric, and then somebody would turn up and set up a free food kitchen, and then
the Hare Krishnas would arrive, and the festival aid would show up, and
yeah.
somehow 30,000 people eventually would arrive in a field at Stonehenge at one of the,
and nobody had organised it. What really was that thing?
Yeah.
Build it and they will come. This was like, do a poster. And I think years later the same thing used to happen with raves, didn't it? With Castle Morton.
Yeah, there'd be a phone number on a slip of paper, and then everyone would appear in the woods.
Yeah.
PA would arrive.
Yeah.
The music would kick in. And anyway, while we were at this, or recently after leaving, Stonehenge Festival is much more famous for an issue that occurred in 1985 when the police and Margaret Thatcher smashed the whole scene to smithereens and more or less destroyed it in a flash. But previous to that was this fantastic festival and this fantastic thing that anybody who ever went to will only ever speak well of. And it occurred to me that there were 30,000 of us in this field, and that if we'd have used the intervening period to collectively raise some funds and invest them in our futures and in everybody's futures, we could have put £5 a month each into some sort of land fund. Now, if there's 30,000 people and you times that by £5, that's £150,000 a month, which already in the first month would give you the opportunity to buy, at that time, quite a bit of land, really. But if you think going forward at the end of 12 months, that would be £1.8 million, and by this point in time, 40 years later, would have been more than approaching £80 million worth of land that we could have collectively purchased and returned either as commons or, it's a very, very far-fetched idea, but it was an idea I had.
And from those kind of what some people might think are crazy ideas, other things sprout from them, and you might not get to that point, but that kind of logic helps you get to other places.
So I've always had this faith, misplaced in many occasions, in crowdfunding, and in the last couple of days as well, I've been thinking a lot about the All the Madmen Records thing, and when the mob reformed back in 2011, we thought, let's resurrect All the Madmen, which was a tiny little fanzine and label that we ran in Yeovil back in the 80s, and which grew and developed and changed over the years. But I just thought, let's bring it back, and I said to my daughter Tess at the time, let's get everyone to give us 50 quid, we'll start a record label and we'll produce some records. And by the end of about 3 weeks, we had £7,500 and all these members, and we were on our way to making records. And I love the idea of crowdfunding. It's not necessarily all about the money. It's about the sharing of a communal experience as much as anything. It's feeling like you have a hand in it. You've helped, even from afar, from whatever. You just like the idea, and you think, "Fuck it," I like what they do. It's funny. It's amusing. It's cool.
And you're contributing to people that are doing something creative and putting something into the world. And if you believe, in art and ideas and other ways of living, alternative ways of living, alternative energy, then really we all need to help each other out, because we're not going to be helped by governments and by corporations.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. A lot of artistic endeavours, and now we're coming back to the modern day and to Rockaway and to what we're doing here with Patreon, but a lot of the endeavours that we do here are not going to be supported by mainstream funders and things like that, because we're fundamentally against quite a lot of what they're in favour of, which isn't really going to help. It doesn't help because we had the sort of Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme came here wanting to, which is a noble enough cause in its own right and everything, but it wasn't hugely helped by the fact that Murney had painted a big piece of graffiti about old sausage fingers, which was fundamentally fucked us. so it came as a complete bolt out of the blue that the Mob were doing a gig at all. But as we were going to do this gig, we thought, let's sell the tickets through Patreon. We've really wanted to open up this avenue of Patreon as a format. You give £3 or £5 a month, and in return you get some special treatment, like you get the podcast a little bit before somebody else gets it. I certainly don't want anyone to not get it because they haven't paid, because clearly many people haven't got any money, and that's perfectly reasonable, sensible. Do not fucking send us any. But equally, there's many people out there to whom £3 or £5 or £10 a month is neither here nor there, and that's the people we're really reaching out to in one way or another. Is like, if you're able to help in any tiny way to, like in the same way that me and Steve are helping to do what we do. We're sitting around doing this. No one's paying us to do it. We're doing, I don't take any just out of interest, because it obviously troubles me to be asking for money when I actually look fairly fucking comfortable to most people, and I am. But in order to advance what we do here at Rockaway, and I think as a result of the fact that 450 of you are going to come and visit the site and see what we do with your own eyes and engage with what we do, that I feel that going forwards you might want to help us. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, there's, in a way, we're kind of talking to two constituencies here, aren't we? Because there are people that are obviously fans of the Mob and coming to the gig and might not know about Rockaway and what you've done here. Conversely, there are a lot of people that know Rockaway for what it does, but probably don't have much idea about you and the Mob
and our backgrounds and where we all come from.
So that's quite an interesting. So maybe we could just talk a bit about some of the things that go on at Rockaway.
Yeah, and I'm also conscious that a lot of people come here and say, like, how the hell do you make this work?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have any sensible structure. It doesn't operate like a business. If it did operate like a business, it would be massively successful. But it doesn't want to operate as a business. It wants to operate more as some of the many things we do here. Is like, currently we've had to escape to the house to do this interview, but in the yard there's about 20 students from the University of the West of England who are doing a thing about storytelling, and they're telling the stories of the objects that I've just shown them. Right. In the yard. There's somebody else is working on the trying to get the heat pump situation so that we can demonstrate the solar. We're working on all these sort of things. We're building a big massive solar array to try and take the venue itself off grid. But these are all that's just physical things. What I find myself doing, a lot of my job, if I had a job, appears to be like telling people to go, flap your wings and fly. You can't, don't let anyone let you think you can't do what you want to do. The thing you imagine is actually possible, and that's something I think that a lot of people get coming here, don't they?
Yeah.
Well, he fucking did it. Do you know, like, it can't be totally impossible because I know this guy and he's done this thing, you know? And there's a lot of that. Hopefully that empowers other people to think, well, I could do that. I could do what I want to do too, thing that thing I care about.
And I mean, we know that because in our lives, we saw other people that inspired us, whether it was, here and now and doing free tours and free festivals, or visiting some art installation in the middle of the desert, in Joshua Tree or something, and seeing things like that, and you come back and think, there are possibilities. There are possibilities in life.
Initially, like, I asked Steve if we could do this podcast because I was feeling like uncomfortable about the fact that we're asking people to help us do this thing that we're doing anyway, but I want it to grow. I want it to be much more than it is. It's got the capacity to be much more. We ran a welding course last year for young women, and we ran 2 courses 6 women on each course over 6 weeks, 1 day a week each. And so we taught 12 young women to weld and to do woodwork and everything. In fact, Siobhan, who led the woodworking element of it, has just dropped in for lunch, and she's from South Wales.
Yeah.
So it obviously left an impression on her, and she was one of the facilitators. But we received a small amount of funding from an element of the council. It came to £7,000, and it cost us more than that to run the course, but it was fantastic, and the joy on those people's faces, what they gained from it, and everything. It's been reported back to us time and time again. We had 38 people on the waiting list who wanted to do it, but there is no more funding, And I don't want to, like, I spoke to another woman over the weekend about the fact that we could run more welding courses, but they had to be paid, which would effectively mean that only really comfortable middle class people could afford to do them. And that's not the people who need to do them. Or not necessarily the people that need to do them.
I mean, those people probably do need.
They need to do them too.
The cat's getting
the cat's insisting on becoming part of this interview and is now stood in front of the speaker.
Right, I'm going to put you on. Do you want to go and see Mark?
I really don't want to see you, but there you go. If you insist, here you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same with all things, isn't it? People in well-paid professional jobs up in London and the South East can afford to go on these sorts of courses, and you see them going on them all the time, from metal work to
do Reiki for the weekend.
building things out of that untreated wood. But these things need to be accessible to everybody. And that's just one example of the things that are going on here. If you think about also, there's the Forest School here, there's the garden, there's Normal Magic.
Yeah, I mean, I was very, very moved by listening to Steve's last podcast, which was with Normal Magic, and Sarah and Tracy that run Normal Magic. Sarah just arrived here one day because she was late going up to pick up her daughter from the airport. And called in here because she saw it on Google Maps. She was immediately very much attracted to the place, and we spent quite a long time talking. I showed her around, we walked around the place, and it turned out she has a really fascinating project to do with young people's mental health, primarily young people's mental health, but we've all got problems with our mental health, I'm sure. And her and Tracy have been coming here ever since on our Sunday markets and doing a drop in sort of intervention for. Sarah can explain about it much better than I can on the other podcast.
They're here on the market days, and they're set up in a room that I think we call the classroom, or they call the classroom, although it's not like one of the classrooms where I was oppressed and repressed for 15 years or whatever it was. And if you have any concerns about mental health, about well-being, anxiety, anything that is on your mind, they will talk to you about it, because they run a scheme in Exeter where they provide single session drop-ins. I mean, like Mark, I'm not going to try and explain everything they do, but they're qualified mental health nurses, and they're doing some really, really interesting work. Now, they come here once a month on a Sunday just to make themselves available to anybody that's here that feel they need that kind of support. And that's very much how a lot of things work at Rockaway. People come here and do stuff that is really, really needed and not provided by the state, either at a local or
and equally makes
level.
Absolutely no sense in a financial world, a world driven by money. This stuff makes no sense at all, but we all know, we all have members of our families and friends who struggle. We all know the importance and how much. It's just not going to come from the government. The government are not going to help us. We have to help ourselves. And I think we have to move away from a mindset where we sort of share memes blaming, bad decisions of the government for our issues. Well, obviously it's their fucking fault. It's their fault, but they're not going to put it right. And we are actually quite competent in a lot of ways, and we can help to put things right, and we're probably better off doing it anyway. I don't know. I just despair with it.
I mean, I think we come from a world where there was this concept of the alternative society, which basically meant that the state and capitalist corporations were not providing people, and we set up our own things, whether that's and that could be on the level of whole food collectives, drug bust organisations like Release, legal organisations giving advice to people, community cafes, the
Squatters Advisory Centres,
Squatters Centres, alternative technology. And if you think now about the alternative technology or whatever it's called in Wales, I mean, that was basically the first time I heard of that was at Stonehenge, and it seemed to be a bunch of hippies that had some idea about building a windmill, and now it's one of the most authoritative centres for research into alternative energy.
And it's funny, like literally 5 minutes before you walked through the door, I was talking to Rich, who's working on the plumbing, who said that his entire sort of career in looking into this stuff came from him going to the Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth when he was a child, because his grandma happened to live nearby, so he popped in there all the time. But the thing with that, and it's quite an interesting thing, because it's bloody miles away, isn't it? It's bloody miles away from us. So I've only ever been there once. I went there probably the week or two before the pandemic, and kicked in, and it was the last place we went in the old world. And I thought at the time, we need some of this a little bit closer to the M4, a little bit closer to where people are. Like, we could show off a lot of this technology here because we're in a good position and we've got a lot of footfall and what have you. And only yesterday we were putting solar panels on the roof of the big sheds here, and the guy that was helping me to do it, he said, what we need to put is great big dials and displays on the walls so that we can show kids what's going on. And I said, yes, this is exactly what we need to do. We need to spark the imaginations of the people coming through. And, we're all up for doing it, you know what I mean? And so, I mean, where we're going with this, even we keep dripping miles away from the subject, is that, we could do a lot more of it. And we're really hoping that I'm really hoping, and a lot of why I wanted to do this at all was that I wanted to reach out to people and say, if we know a lot of you have joined this Patreon because it made it possible to buy a ticket for a gig, and somebody did comment on it only yesterday, I think, and it said sort of, I'm not joining a monthly subscription just to get a ticket for a gig, and I replied back, it was never just about a ticket to a gig, all the way back to 1976 or 77 when we discovered punk rock and changing the world and all the things that led us to where we are today. It was never just about a ticket to a gig.
No, absolutely not. And if people think that bands like The Mob, Zounds, Crass, Poison Girls, whoever, were just about a good night out.
Yeah, you sort of missed the point.
You wanted, of course it was a good night out. That was, because they were great bands with great people in them. But it was much, much more than that. The thing that drove the music is the same thing that is driving the ideas here at Rockaway.
I found myself in this position here because I'm something of a workaholic, as anyone who's ever spent 10 minutes with me will know. Yeah,
Mark hasn't got a job, but he never stops working.
I couldn't. My cousin once said to me last year, have you ever had a proper job? I was like, I've never had a proper job, and I wouldn't really be suited to it. But I work constantly, and so I sort of.
In contrast to me, who's had a lot of proper jobs and never done any work at any of them. Sorry, I interrupted.
That's right. So it's sort of how we ended up here is because I'm a psychotic maniac who works and works and works and works. And when I lived in a caravan many years ago, I thought, well, the only thing I know anything about is vans, because I used to drive them on tours and things. So I started taking vans apart and selling the spares, and of course, because I'm a fucking maniac, I ended up with 400 or 500 vans spread across 3 or 4 yards in Bristol, and I was spending an awful lot of money on rent, even though I had this ridiculously huge business. It didn't make any sense as usual, and eventually we bought this place because it made more sense, but it was the other end of the world from the motorway network that I needed to make it a success, and over 10 years we managed to go bankrupt and lose it, but miraculously hold on to the land. And then I thought, I actually didn't want to do this in the first place. What I really want to do is something that makes a difference in the world.
And I did another podcast with Mark that if you haven't listened to, you really should, because Mark explains the whole process of how he ended up here and the transition from what it was and into what it is now, and in a way a kind of return to your roots.
Yeah, I think certainly from where I'm sitting, I feel like this is what I was born to do. I wasn't born to take transit vans apart, although I still. This morning somebody did ring me and ask me if I knew where they could get a spare wheel for a Mercedes 608, and it's never going to leave me. And also, interestingly enough, and bringing us back to the world of magic and crowdfunding and the way that things are never quite what they seem, we were putting up solar yesterday, and I must have shared a post about solar over the last week or so, and this morning, totally out of the blue, a Polish guy that I used to do business with in the van braking business, he owed me 45,000 quid, and this was one of the many reasons why we went bankrupt. And out of the blue this morning, this is 12 years ago, he phoned up this morning and said, I see you're doing PV solar on the, in the yard, and he said, I can send you a pallet of solar panels. He said, free of charge, I owe you the money. And I was like, wow. That's the sort of magic that we generate.
You never know when you put things out there, and you never know when it's going to, sometimes it doesn't come back, sometimes it does. Back, sometimes it comes back with more. And
I've got this great belief in, like, everyone says, well, that'll never work. And I said, of course it won't if you don't fucking try, but if you try, it may work, and it may actually go much better than you imagined.
Yeah, for sure.
You could take that as a bad thing. He went, he owed me 45 grand. He fucking went bust, just left me high and dry. I was fucked, this, blah, blah, blah. But that, I like adversity because I use it as fuel.
Energy.
As energy. And so everything went wrong, but in a way, Rockaway would never have happened if it hadn't gone wrong. I'd still be taking vans apart and pulling my hair out and dealing with maniacs the whole time. And suddenly you're doing solar, and and it's all cushy, and he's back again. And everybody's happy. And panels, and I couldn't have been more pleased to hear from him, regardless of the money or the solar panels or anything.
The solar panels now are probably more useful than, as you say, than the 45 grand was then. Anything else we want to say, Mark, for the? No, not really. We're going to try and work out what we can do for the patrons in return, and we think it would be really handy. Well, I was talking to Michelle about this. Michelle's Dick Lucas's partner from the Subhumans. It also occurred to me last night that it's the little haven of old anarcho-punks, isn't it? Like me and Steve are obviously anarcho-punk rock stars, as is Dick Lucas and Jazz Wiseman, who rang me up last night to say, can I come and help with all the madmen and get the record label back up and going again, perhaps under the wing of Rockaway. We're a half-handy place if you're an old codger with nothing better to do to just drop in anyway. I mean, that's one of the things I love about Rockaway, is that people come here with ideas and they want to do things.
Yeah, can you help me with this, or can you just tell me I'm an idiot, or can you give me some encouragement?
Yeah, it's really an open invitation to people who have ideas and want to do things and collaborate in any way, but it's done in a certain spirit. And that's
which is very much the spirit of all the things we started this conversation with about Stonehenge and punk rock and Here and Now, and passing a hat round at the end of the night and seeing if we can rustle up the money to get to the next show. And you know, we're still doing it. It's still working. It's, you know, hopefully a lot of you are coming here for this gig. Hopefully you'll see for yourselves. And, you know, even as we're sat here now, it sounds like we're having a nice, pleasant conversation, and the cat sat on my lap, driving me mad. But as the second we press off on this button, and I'll send the pictures over to Steve so that he can put them with the video, with the podcast, to show you what we're actually doing. We've got a fella on his way with a lorry and a great big crane who's going to put this accommodation block on top of the toilet block that we recently made, all of which is absolutely crazy, as you'll see from the photos. But it never stops, and you know, anything that anyone can do to give us a hand is always welcome. And I hope some of this made some sort of sense.
Thanks for that, Mark. Been an absolute pleasure again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cheers.
Goodbye, everybody.
Ta-da.